So before we do any presentation at Royal Roads, we always want to acknowledge that we live, learn, and work on the traditional lands of the Kosepsum and the Kwangan ancestors and families. And learning has been happening here for countless generations, and we're so grateful to be on this land. And I also just want to take a quick moment to acknowledge that we are in month 7 or maybe even 8 now of this global health crisis that we've been all navigating. And of course, there's been so many inequity and social issues that have been highlighted through this time. And I know everyone on this call is really thinking about a way forward. How can we co-create a new reality that's better than the one that we were in before? And that's really what Royal Roads is about as a university and what design thinking is about. It's about coming together and collaboratively making new ideas come to life in some really creative ways. So I'm so grateful to all of you being here today to explore this with us. And just in case you're not familiar with Royal Roads, I just wanted to give a super quick overview of the land that we're situated on. So we are in Victoria, BC on Vancouver Island in British Columbia and within Canada. And Royal Roads University has a very extensive background. It was a gathering place for our Indigenous peoples of this land. And then in the early 1900s, the Dunsmuir built a castle. So it became a historical site in terms of that kind of colonial history as well. And they only lived there for a few decades, and then the federal government took over the land, and it was a military college till '95, and then became a public university with a different type of mandate. So a mandate that was really about giving people a different kind of education experience that was very applied and making real change in the world. And we are also on some beautiful land in terms of the natural landscape. We are on 565 acres of old growth. We're right on a lagoon that actually feeds right into the ocean. And we have been delivering online learning for 25 years, which is something we're so proud of right now. And with that, we're going to dive right in. So we are here to explore insights that spark innovation, introduction to design thinking methods. So I am going to pass the mic over to Amy Zidulka, who is a Royal Roads University Associate Professor. Thank you, Amy.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Alana. So to build on what Alana was saying, of course, we are on a historic day as well, and a day of change. And many of us, it's hard to concentrate even because we're very focused on what's going on with our neighbors in the South. So thank you for coming today. And as I woke up this morning and was thinking about, you know, this big thing going on in the world, a historic day, and then this webinar coming up at noon, I was thinking, well, it's good that we can put our minds to this for an hour. And the root of design thinking, and what Chris will be talking about, is about empathy and about deeply understanding those for whom you're solving problems. So that does seem fitting for today. And I think Chris will be giving us some structure around how to enact empathy in terms of, in a very real, concrete, tactical way when we're going about trying to innovate or solve problems. So in terms of today, we're here for 2 reasons. One is we're just here to learn from somebody who's developed real mastery of design methods and approaches and the mindset over many years, and that is Chris Ferguson, who I will introduce shortly. And so just to learn together in that very practical way and maybe philosophical as well. And then the second reason is this is part of the lead up to the Royal Roads Design Thinking Challenge. And that challenge is something we're really proud of here at Royal Roads. And I want to talk about it for a second, and we'll come back to it at the end, because I know that some of you on the call are here because of the challenge and others might be here out of more general interest. So in terms of the challenge, it's learners from across, this year it will be across Canada and the United States, addressing a challenge that is of societal concern. So these are business students, but we're not focused on only a business, we're focused on helping, on contributing more broadly to society. And they use design thinking methods, and they learn design thinking methods through the design thinking challenge. So it's a process where, for example, if in our first year doing it, it was the mayor of Victoria was the client, and she put out a challenge around reducing single occupancy vehicles. And we had students in Montreal, in Edmonton, in Victoria, all on the ground, understanding what that challenge meant in their location, and then coming together to share those insights, iterate on their first ideas, and come to something that was even stronger than they could have come to on their own or in their own city or without using design methods. So that's what we're going to be doing. And before I sort of introduce Chris, if you're here for the reason of the challenge, if you're either thinking about enrolling or you are enrolled, could you just indicate that in the chat box so I can see how many people are here associated with the challenge? Or if you're a coach who's coaching the challenge, could you just put that up maybe? I'll keep talking though as we go. Maybe I'll continue with the introduction with Chris. So our main show today is really Chris Ferguson, who's going to share some methods with us. And I guess he is a founder of the design studio Bridgeable, which is a major player in the design world in Canada. And he also serves as an international figure in terms of design and business in terms of design and business. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto, and his work has received global recognition. So he's received multiple Good Design Awards, the DMI Design Value Award, and he received the Innovation by Design Award from Fast Company. So very, we're very lucky to have him here today. He writes and speaks regularly all over about design thinking and design and service design specifically. And he's currently co-authoring a book on how to navigate the conflict between design-led approaches and traditional business approaches. I would also say that he is an alum of Royal Roads. Chris did his BCom here in the early 2000s, and his entrepreneurial project with us was called Cooler Solutions. I remember it well. And that eventually went on and became Bridgeable. So he's definitely a Royal Roads boy that makes us very proud and that we're very happy to welcome home. So with no further ado, I will pass it on to Chris. And so, sorry, for those learning more about the challenge, we will come back to it at the end and you will have time to ask questions. And Chris, you take it away.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today. And thank you, Amy, for that generous introduction. And I'm definitely feeling like I'm missing Royal Roads right now when you were showing all the pictures of the campus, since it's been snowing here in Toronto the last couple of days. So nice to see and think of the fond memories that I had there. So I'm just gonna share my screen here with you all. All right, can everyone see that okay? Great. Well, very excited to be here talking to you about design research as a way to approach innovation and to share some specific examples of different methods and tools that you can apply in your work, or if you happen to be attending the challenge. But I wanted to start with a bit of a research parable. A parable about often what goes wrong in the ways that traditional organizations have approached research. And the parable goes like this, and it relates to the image in front of you. So one evening, someone comes down and they're leaving their work and they look outside in the parking lot and they see a group of people down on their hands and knees looking around under a lamppost. So they walk over to them and they ask what they're doing, and they discover that they've lost their car keys. And so they say, okay, well, I'll help you out looking for your car keys. And they get down and they're on their hands and knees and they're looking with them. And after a while of looking and by talking to them, they actually realize that their car keys aren't there, that they lost them in a different part of the parking lot. And they said, well, why are you looking here? And they said, well, this is where the light is. And what ends up happening oftentimes with research within large organizations is research gets collected that's convenient to collect, that's easy to sample, that's predictable to collect. So for example, things around, customer experience. And while you might get data that you can track over a longer period of time and that you can collect fairly easily, it's not always the right kind of research that tells you what's really going on here. Like, why is this happening? Why? And it also doesn't spark opportunities for you to change or to come up with innovative new strategies. And that's where design research comes in. So Amy had provided the background, so I won't do that. But what I want to do today is talk about a few different levels of design research. And this is a model that comes from mainly from Liz Sanders, who's a great academic in the UK, who wrote a book called The Convivial Toolbox, which you can check out. But they talk about 3 different methods. First of all, interviewing. How do you just go out and talk to people in a way that you can, find out new ideas for innovation? Observation, applying more of these kind of ethno-methodological approaches, like a ethnographer would do when they're going and studying, coming of age rituals in Samoa, but applying those to business challenges. And finally, co-design. And part of what I'll talk about as well is how you can deepen your level of insight and deepen your level of understanding by going through these different methods. But I wanted to start with a little warm-up activity for you all. This is something that I would normally do if we were in person. I'd have, we'd stand up and we'd go around and do an activity. But it's going to be a bit more of a thought exercise at this point. So what I want you to do is I'm going to give you 30 seconds. I want you to just go through the list of people who are on this. I just want you to count the number of people who are on this who have either the same first initial or last initial as you. Okay, so just go through quickly the list and just count them up. Okay, 15 seconds. Okay, stop. All right, that was your first activity. Now I've got a second activity that I want you to do. I want you to go through that same list of people, and I want you to think about if you had to make as many people on that list as you could, make them happy. Imagine going through the list there, and now I don't just have to count up. I don't just have to go through the task of kind of tabulating. I have to go through and make them all happy. And what are the kinds of things that come up for you? It could be, well, I don't know these people. Like, I don't know what makes them happy. Or even if I have an idea, like, well, how would I bring that idea to life of making them happy? Like, what are the kind of materials or resources I need? And is it different? Like, is it going to be very different for some of these people versus other people? Do I have to try different kinds of strategies? And so why I do this activity and hopefully this simulation via Zoom helped with is kind of the difference between a complicated task and a complex task. And often what we're trained to do, particularly I think through traditional management studies, is to deal with complicated tasks, but not so much to deal with the kind of complexity that we now experience in the world. So I just want to compare these differences. So a complicated problem, so when I gave you the idea of going through and just tabulating, there was high certainty around it. There was a clear problem, there was one right answer, and there was a clear outcome. You knew when you were done, right? You just had to go through. When you set out, you knew what you had to get done. And really the kinds of skills you needed to apply were around kind of optimization. You needed data, logic, analysis, prediction. Like these are the muscles you kind of had to use in order to solve those problems. But then when I said, go and make people happy, well, that's a complex problem, very high uncertainty, an unclear problem. Like, I don't know, what's happiness mean to these people? Many possible answers. and an unclear outcome. Actually, when you began that task, where you ended up in the end, you couldn't know at the beginning of the project. And so what this requires is more exploration skills. So, curiosity, intuition, experimentation, empathy. So just like a different set of muscles that you're required to deal with these kinds of problems. And this is where these kinds of design research methods come in. They really help deal more with these kinds of complex problems. So if standard business research tells us what is, it's often looking at, kind of the past and thinking about, let's just kind of capture a phenomena that's happening right now. And I often think about the analogy of it's like you're looking in your rear view mirror and using it as your steering wheel. You're trying to steer your car in a new direction, but you're only ever looking at the past, right? Compare that to design research. So design research is trying to understand, well, why? Well, the customer satisfaction data says people prefer online to in-store. It says they're really disappointed with this part of our service experience. Well, why? Why is that happening? And then what could be, right? What's possible here for us? So these different methods actually reveal deeper levels of insight, as I mentioned before. So if you think about with the case of interviewing, what you're going to get through interviewing are things like what people say and think. Through observation, you're going to get to what people do and what they use by actually going out and seeing what people are doing kind of in their context and in their home and in stores and healthcare settings and in educational settings where they actually do things. And through methods like co-design, you get to more things around what people know, what they feel, or what they dream about, what they would love to have happen in that situation. And the different forms of knowledge. So in interviewing, you're going to get explicit knowledge. So the things that people can like easily think about and recall. Through observation, this observative, you're going to get knowledge that you can actually observe. And through co-design, more the tacit things that people do that they don't even realize that they're doing. And then latent needs that they don't even realize that they have that you could satisfy. Okay, so we're going to get into each of these now. And what I'm going to do is spend a bit of time talking about each of these methods, kind of what they're all about, give a couple of examples, and then we'll have a chat at the end about them. Okay, so interviewing. So interviewing allows you to understand the world through the eyes of your participant. And when you're doing the kind of design research interviews, it's purposefully open-ended. You really go in thinking that you want the interviewee to guide the conversation. So in these conversations, you're really seeking depth. So for example, tell me more versus breadth. And I'm sure we've all had this experience where you're being surveyed on the phone and someone, you can tell they're just trying to get through all the questions and it's on to the next one. Okay. They're just kind of checking the boxes. And the aim is really to understand themes, to identify, are there patterns as I talk to people and they talk about their experiences that can actually level up to the point of insight. And I really think about insight as being something that's both novel, like this is new information, but it's also relevant. It's relevant to the problem at hand. So that balance of like, this is new information, but I think it can really help us with this problem. So some of the pros, so it's pretty easy relatively to plan and deploy, and it can be easier and more accessible for participants. You can call up a whole bunch of people and do interviews a bunch in a day. And depending on the subject matter, if it's more sensitive, it's more difficult for participants, but it's often pretty easy for people to participate in from a research point of view. The cons, I think when you're doing this kind of research, you really need to balance these open-ended questions with meeting your research objective. You don't want to go too far off so that it's a bit of a dance. It takes practice in order to do that well. And interviewing, you can end up with platitudes where people are like, well, I always eat healthy. I go to the gym every day and, or I would never do that. You have to be careful if it's actually authentically about how people, what they're just saying or how they actually behave. just as an example of the power of kind of an open-ended interview versus more of a traditional research interview. So traditional research, you might get something like, hey, rate your last service interaction on a scale of 1 to 10. Where in design research, it would be something like, hey, imagine you have a magic wand and you could make this service the best way possible. How would you improve it? You know, you're going to get very different kinds of data depending on the kinds of questions you ask. So that's interviewing. Let's talk a bit about observation. So now we're getting kind of deeper into these deeper levels of kind of understanding human experience and being able to really connect and empathize with people. So observations allow you to understand not just what people say, but what they're actually doing. And these immersions take place in situ, or, you know, just where people are doing the thing that you're studying, right? So that could be inside their homes, could be following for shop alongs as they're shopping, could be in an office setting, but you're actually going, like I mentioned before, like an anthropologist, and you're going and embedding yourself in that place and you're trying to understand it and study it. The aim is to understand, and again, these are kind of anthropological terms, but like artifacts and rituals, right? Like, what are the things that are around, you know, and then the rituals and routines that people go through that have cultural meaning to your research participants. A pro here, you know, really you get a lot of contextual information that's hidden. So you get this kind of layer of understanding. You know, for example, I've been out where, you know, when I was doing something around healthcare with people with diabetes, and as you spend a couple of hours with people and you actually understand, you know, not just, oh, I always eat healthy, I never drink, blah, 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 but they say, you know what, I like to, you know, have a drink of wine at the end of the night, and here's actually the snacks that I have. And you kind of like understand a bit more about how their life works and the realities of what's going on. The cons, this kind of research takes a lot more time. It's a lot more intrusive. You're asking more of your participants in order to do this. And it's actually quite helpful if you're doing this kind of work to have more of a kind of social science background. Some training or understanding of cultural theory from sociology and or anthropology. And that just helps you kind of have a lens on what you're looking at and not associate it too much personally with your own experience. An example that came from Bank of America, they wanted to innovate their banking offering. And so they sent people out to actually understand what was going on with their services. And one thing they observed was people, when they were paying their bills, they kept rounding up. So if it was, in this example, it's $27.40, they just like round up. They don't want to write a check for that. They would just make a check for $30 and send it. So there's this theme they noticed over and over again when they were out around how people with their own financial management were behaving. And so what they did as a result was they launched a program called Keep the Change, where you could actually set up this thing automatically on your bank account. Anytime that you were making a purchase, it would actually round up that change and put it into a savings account. And so for most people, this led to like several $100s of savings per year. It attracted a bunch of customers over to them as a bank because it was kind of like a novel way of saving that felt pretty easy, and it was kind of in line with a ritual that they already had in their lives. So I want to do a little experiment here, and this will require you all going into the chat. So when you're in these situations, you know, it's really important to kind of understand, again, what's happening from the point of view of the participants. So just as a little experiment, if you'll indulge me, just want you to take a look at this image. Oh, sorry. I have a piece first. Here, I'll come back to this. I'll show you guys this. So this image, I'll tell you, was taken pre-COVID. So I want you to look at this. What's going on in this picture, and why are these people wearing masks? So in the chat, just if you're, you know, just take a guess. This is before there was a pandemic going on. You know, why are these people wearing masks? And I will look at the chat. To protect the paintings, yeah. They're in Asia, maybe a concern about SARS, art gallery, sensitive material, flu, whoa. Experiential art, yeah. It's common for Asians to wear masks whenever they want to, yeah, to protect the air. Yeah, museum, very old paintings. It's mandatory, they were in a hospital. Yeah, great. Awesome, awesome. So you can see here a lot of yes, interesting. Yeah, Paul's on to me here with the solution. Okay, so you can see you're all looking at the exact same image, a lot of different interpretations. And one thing, so actually, it's actually considered it's considerate to wear a mask if you're sick, particularly in Asian cultures, where within a more North American context, I mean, this is before COVID, if someone were to come in wearing a mask, it'd be easy to interpret it as, what do you think I'm gonna get, like, I'm gonna get you sick? Like, it's the consideration would be like, oh, you're protecting yourself from something, versus actually, I'm trying to protect you, right? So it's very important when we're going in and doing this kind of work to be aware of our own cultural bias. Like, we all have our own experiences, we all have our own background. Anyone who's ever moved to a different country or even a different province might have found there are these things that just everyone takes for granted, and suddenly you're in a different context, and these things, the norms, the expectations, the cultural lens that people look through is different. So it's very important to consider that as you're doing this kind of work. Okay, I'm gonna go back to this one. So just a tool to think about that's really helpful when you're doing this kind of approach of doing this kind of observational work is an environmental audit. So when you're going in, you're first of all thinking about factual observations, and you're looking at these different kinds of elements: the people, like who are the actors or the people that are involved, the space, you know, what's happening in the space, what's the environment like, objects, are there different kinds of objects that are around, the activities that people are engaging in, and then the sequence or the timing of things. And what you want to do is observe those almost like just the facts, like as much as you can, really identifying the facts. And then you want to associate interpretation with it. But you want to keep these separate. So you want to think about, well, when it comes to interpretation, what about values? What about the cultural and symbolic value of things? So for example, people have books stacked up on every surface. Or there's a big screen TV in the middle of the room. And it could be, well, those objects are actually important to this person because it's important to them that they are informed, or they just want to seem well read. So they have these objects around, or the large screen TV in the middle of the space. Actually, this is the main place in which the family gets together and where most of their activities take place. But you just want to actually observe and think about the facts of what's happening in the space, and then the potential interpretations. Okay, co-design. This is the one I'm most excited about, and I've got some more details here. And I'm going to show you an activity that I think if you're doing the design challenge, it's hopefully helpful for you. Okay, so co-design deploys activities or probes as a research technique to inspire ideas. And you're actually applying some sort of stimulus, like you're bringing something in, and that could be templates or images or a diary or something, and then different evocative tasks. You're giving people activities to do. And the aim is to actually record specific events, feelings, or interactions. The resulting insights give you a deep understanding into, things people may do unconsciously. They might just have been going through, and you're trying to kind of peel back and get a bit more insight into that, and opportunity areas for innovation. So the pros can be pretty easy to deploy. It increases recall. You get a lot of novel responses, and you can actually give it to an individual to do, or you could scale an activity across a whole bunch of people to do it at the same time. either as a facilitated session or something you send out remotely. The cons, it's subjective. You really need the right kind of stimulus, the right kind of activity, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. And I'll show you a few different ones that you could think about for the work you're doing. And it requires user motivation or facilitation to complete the task. So things, if you're giving them to people, they need to be motivated to complete it, or you need to facilitate it properly. Here's an example of an activity journal, and this is a project we did many years ago for the company Spin Master, and it was for a helicopter toy they had called Air Hogs, which some of you might remember. And they had a lot of these helicopters getting returned with no reason being stated for the return. So there was a kind of form people could fill out when they returned it, but most of the people returning didn't have a stated reason for doing it. And since this happened, the time between when somebody purchased it and when they returned it, it was kind of a longer period of time. We needed a way to study what was happening then. And so we used a kind of activity journal in order to do that. And what we found was actually people were really excited at first. And then after about a week, because it was actually incredibly difficult to fly this thing, people were less just really unenthusiastic. And by the end of 2 weeks, no one was using it. It was like complete, like 100% of respondents, no one was using it anymore. And people didn't even want to look at it. And this was really disappointing because the kid felt like a bit of a failure. You know, they had this really great toy. And then parents who, you know, if you think about, often toys are like the work of children. You know, like you give things to children and you want them to kind of enjoy it or be successful at the thing you give them. And the parents were feeling like very disappointed and angry that it wasn't working out for their kids. So you're able to get some insight by having these activities and having them think about, and then we were able to come up with a number of ideas through the facilitated activities around kind of support services, like training, I guess, on how you could do these things, some levels that people could progress through in order to make it a less frustrating experience. Here's a digital reflection journal. So this was people going through the buying insurance. And again, this is something that takes place over time. And how this was facilitated was actually as a WhatsApp group. So people going through that insurance buying experience were asked to be a part of this community, and they were given different tasks as they went through it. So they were asked to reflect on why they were choosing certain elements over others. And there was a combination of kind of videos and coming from the researchers, asking them to do things, and then feedback from the participants. And the nice thing with it being a group is it could actually almost be, ideas could be workshopped amongst the different participants. There's digital missions. So there's an organization out of Chicago called D-Scout, and they have a big pool of people and you can actually send missions to them. So for example, if you had a new service or a new app, you could actually send people out to go try it and go through an experience and then ask them specific questions or recommendations of how they could improve it, which is a nice way to collect this kind of feedback and to get them, again, to elicit some of those latent needs or perhaps some of the tacit things that they're going through in these experiences that wouldn't otherwise be observable. It's templated activities. This one was around first-time home buyers and thinking about what were the things that motivated people around their first home. So again, a number of different activities that were meant to help people understand so they could better address the needs of people going through that kind of like big milestone experience. So this one I'm going to show you, and I recommend that you try this out if you're going through the challenge and if you're working on something service-oriented. This is kind of a storyboard activity. And I'll show you an example. So when we're doing these storyboard activities, we're often having people talk through what's the experience that you're going through currently, and then what's the ideal experience? We're having them do it twice. And we had these ones, which was around people going through the cell phone renewal process, which is like, one of the circles of hell, that you have to kind of go through a couple of years. But first having them think about, hey, what's that experience like? And then how would you like that to go? What would an ideal experience be like? And by having them actually go through these things, again, you're not only getting them to maybe evoke and think about specific elements of the experience that would be hard to identify just through a conversation, but you're also, by having them do that generative work around the ideal experience and contrasting them, we're able to map not just the pain points of the current experience, like where are the points in the experience that actually are annoying to people now. We could actually talk about what's their ideal experience. We could contrast it and say, hey, this is really not working, but here's some ways in which we could make this experience work super well for you. So that's these different levels of design research. Really, again, I think that there's a real complement between these if you're able to use them. I think that depending on your certain circumstance that you're in, and again, the pros and cons of these different approaches, you want to think about what's the right one for your situation. I would say as you go through and as you get from interviewing to observation to co-design, the investment of time and energy becomes more, but I think the payoff is potentially higher as well. But yeah, I hope this has been helpful for you to think about as you go in and think about whether it's in your own job or as you think about applying it to Royal Road's Great Design Thinking Challenge that has social benefits. So as I started with, standard business research really talks about what is. Again, it's this looking at the past, it's talking about phenomena. If you want to understand why things are happening, if you want to kind of get that deeper understanding, if you don't want to think about what's possible or what could be, these methods are really, really helpful. And I'll just leave you with a couple of thoughts about this as a mindset and an approach as you go into it, and some helpful things to think about. So when you're going out and doing this research, just remember everything we see, hear, feel, touch, or taste is data. It's easy in these things to become myopic around your research topic and kind of forget about maybe some other opportunity areas that might come up through the conversation. So it's really important to allow your participant to guide the conversation. An example we worked on a project that was it was a mentorship and microfinance program for entrepreneurs that had a history of mental illness or addiction. And it was a program that was like super well intended, mentorship, money for people, for entrepreneurs who've had this history, but it was not having uptake. It just wasn't resonating with people. And when we went to go do our research, we found people kept not showing up for research, which is like super annoying as a researcher, but it was data. And one thing we found, we're like, these are people with unpredictable lives that have a lot of ups and downs happen, and that actually a very rigidly structured program wasn't going to work super well for them, right? So like everything, even not doing your research, can be data. Secondly, we're not objective observers. We really come with our own experience. I think this is a really challenging one, particularly if you're doing research around a topic that's kind of close to you or that you have a lot of familiarity with. I think that as you're doing, if it's within the challenge and it's say something around social benefit or sustainability, you might have your own point of view. It's really important to kind of acknowledge what you bring to it and to allow the other person to explain from their own mental model, from their own point of view, how do they experience it? And that can be challenging, but it's one to keep in mind. And finally, these users or research participants, they're not just objects or data points. I think you can sometimes feel that way if you're going through research, as you pick up the phone at the wrong time and are asked to do things, or you opt in to do some research at the end of some experience. These people are the owners of truth. And actually by taking that more empathetic viewpoint, by really trying to get inside the experience of people who are going through an experience related to the product or service you're developing, you can actually get some really profound and useful insight. So Yeah, hope this has been helpful for you all, and excited to hang out and answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Chris. That was fantastic. And for those of you who are here for the challenge, we will be referring back to this as we go forward with the design thinking challenge, which we'll talk about in a minute. But now, why don't we just open it up for questions and discussion points? You can either type something in the chat or raise your hand. We'd love to see you ask the question, or raise your hand and just put yourself on screen. And so I see that Josh has a question. Do you want to just speak up?
Yeah, hi, Chris. Thanks for this workshop. I just wanted to know one thing. How much emphasis do you pay on your senses when you're doing an observation, on when you're doing your interviewing? Like when we say an interview should be done with a more sensory acuity, what weightage do you pay on that? And has it kind of tricked you sometimes? Because you can involve your own personal biases in that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one thing we try to do as an exercise before we go out and do any kind of field work is actually talking about what our own baggage is related to the topic. And that could be like, what do I expect to see when I get there? What's my own experience around this? And almost trying to just elevate your consciousness around things that might just be in the background. So I think there's some, when you're a researcher and you're going out, that can be a really helpful technique to just kind of ensure. I always think about, I don't know if you've had this experience where you're wearing sunglasses and then the sun goes down, you forget you have them on, and then you like take them off and you're like, whoa, it's really bright. You kind of just end up seeing the world through your own experience, and it can become kind of unconscious. So the more you can do to try to elevate that awareness, I think, as well as I said, I think just having some sort of cultural understanding around the ways in which people behave in the world, I think can be really helpful. To have like some frameworks or distinctions around culture is a good one. And another one I'll just say is, like, usually we always do this at least in partners, and you debrief with your partner afterwards to kind of like keep yourself honest, like, hey, I saw that. Did you hear that? I was thinking this. Oh, I was thinking that when I heard it, but again, the important thing being, you want to get inside the head of the participant, and you want to be as conscious. Like you can never get rid of your own cultural bias. It's just like we're all raised, and that's it's part of the human experience, but you can try to elevate your awareness of it.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Hey, I'll put one forward and we'll see if anything else comes up. So Chris, we very deliberately designed this so that people could walk away with some sense of what the methods were. If you could zoom out for a minute and embed it in, like, what would you say what's the general philosophy that this falls into, but also the average person working in an organization, let's say they're at the mid-level somewhere, how might they use this? Where might this come up for them, that this kind of thing might be useful? Actually, maybe just go with my second question, because those are two big questions. So maybe just go with my second question around the average person, the average working person.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the last method that I showed, which was around actually just mapping elements of an experience that people go through, like the beginning, middle, and end, and having the people who are going through it describe, like, what are your pain points and preferences. I think that can be really helpful, and it's something you can deploy relatively easily, assuming you have some access to your customers, which would be, or the users of your service or experience or product. But actually having them articulate, even like, what do you think the beginning and the end of this thing is? Because often, like, that's different than how an organization thinks about it. Like, the experience might start way before you're thinking about that, they're like where that journey begins. I think that that's a really helpful one. I do think yeah, I would say that. I mean, often starting even with people who are on the front lines can be helpful to give you a kind of starting point with things, because often there are people who have some initial insight into things. But that's one that I would say is an important one.
Thanks. There's a question from M. I'm not sure, I can't see in the chat who it is, but there's a question from M, and then we'll go to some of the questions in the chat. Does the person who wrote, "I have a question," Amy, want to just ask it?
Oh, that's too funny, Amy. It's Ingrid. I think my son's been playing around with the the Zoom name here, but anyway, thank you, Chris, for this. Really enjoyed your presentation there. I'm curious, based on your experience, when as we dig into that sort of more deeper level of research that also requires more kind of, as you're saying, more time commitment from the organization, but also more time commitment of our users or whoever we're designing for, right? Our customers. You know, you talk about kind of tracking, you know, people say, we're asking people to sort of journal and write down their thoughts, you know, as they experience a product or a service over a period of time. How have you found getting that engagement from potential users or the person that you're solving the problem for? Sometimes that, as you're saying, getting that interview or asking somebody to do 5-minute survey only, you know, or the interview only takes 20 minutes of your time, to asking them for more deeper engagement in this kind of more exploratory process. And if you have some sort of tips on how you can get the buy-in, I guess, from users to do that more of a co-design.
Yeah, I mean, often I'd say like paying people for their time is a way to do that. And I think it's important too, just because it's, you know, you're asking people to take time to do this. Often how we'll do that, usually within depending on the organization and what the product or service is, that could be done in some sort of credit to that organization, you know? So sometimes there's creative ways to do it that don't require kind of out-of-pocket, you know, expenses, or there's ways of being, you know, hey, we're going to offer you a gift of some kind or something that kind of just, you know, creates the sense of reciprocity around, like, we care about your opinion and we're going to value it by doing this for you. That said, I'd say there's particular things that people are either super annoyed by or really passionate about, that they're sometimes willing to kind of put the time and energy into in order to do this kind of research. But I do think incentivizing your participants is a way to do it. And that doesn't always have to be kind of cash. That can, you know, you can be creative about how you do that in order to get access to your participants.
Thank you.
And I actually think that was, Ingrid, that was me. I don't know why it's coming up as M, it's Michelle. And nice to see you, Ingrid. I think this is more of the design challenge question, perhaps, but I was actually just wondering about prototyping, if we will be getting to that in the challenge as an outcome from the research.
So so in terms of the design thinking challenge, we will be talking about prototyping. And why don't I put that aside, and so that we'll go on that, but I'd be happy to talk to you about that later or follow up.
Yeah, that's awesome, Amy. Thank you. It just was, as I was thinking about the design-based research that I've done, I'm like, it's sort of led to, and then I'm like, oh, I should just clarify that. So that's awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay.
The natural next step after these methods would be translating, you know, based on the kind of user needs, like what are the kinds of features that would provide the benefit to meet those needs. There's this kind of features and benefits exercise you can do around research and say, okay, if you have a pain point that's this or a preference that's that, how could I associate that with a specific product or service feature? And almost playing that one-to-one game of matching up an unmet need or a preference with a specific feature. And that can be prototyped.
And you have a question.
Oh, okay. I'm going to take one, and that's Josephine. There's a question in the chat that we'll take, and then we'll go to Josephine, then we'll go back to the chat. So in the chat, there's a question around the difference between attempting design as a process and a product. And I know that's something that, you know, as someone who runs a service design company, you've undoubtedly thought about, Chris.
Mm-hmm. So sorry, is the question?
How different is the process when attempting to design a process as opposed to a product?
Yeah, I mean, the issue with process and services is, you know, they talk about like they're invisible, you know, like these things you're designing for these more intangibles, and thinking about often an end-to-end experience. So I mean, there's similarities. There's a lot of, I'd say there's probably more overlap than you think, but I'd say the big thing with a process or a service is you want to take the time to do those kinds of more storyboard or journey type exercises that talk about what are the different steps that people go through, and having them, like, what's their mental model for the beginning, middle, and end of what this experience is. That, and then you also, you want to layer onto that. So if you think about that as the top row, here are the steps people are going through. Down the left-hand column, you'd want to think about what are the channels that they're going through as they're going through those stages. So for example, with like a process or a service, it could be, well, I start online by going online and doing research. And then I go into the retail store and I meet with a representative and I ask them questions. And then I go, and then I get something sent to me that's in the mail that I receive. That's a physical thing, right? So you want to be thinking about stages, and then you want to think about the channels. And that's where it's actually those touch points in aggregate together is what creates a process or a service, right? So it's a bit more of a mind bender when you're doing that, because you almost have to dimensionalize what you're thinking about, versus a product's like a thing you can kind of put your hands around. But so there's just more dimensions to balance.
I think what we're going to do, because I am noticing the time, is let's go to Josephine's question. Then there are some more questions in the chat. Chris, do you have a few minutes to stay after? So I think that what we'll do, I want to talk a little bit about the Design Thinking Challenge for those who are there for that reason. We'll close off at 1 o'clock, and then those who want to stick around, let's just stick around and get to those last few questions, okay? So Josephine, you go ahead, and then we'll go from there.
Thanks. It's actually two-pronged, so I can sneak in two questions here. One is, so very often you'll have an experience or a product that you're trying to redesign. How do you decide who to redesign it for? Because so often there are very different segments of people who are, so do you go in and say, okay, this is primarily the person that we, or the sort of the named person that we're going to redesign this process for? Or does that sort of come out of your research? So that's the first question. And the second question, if you wouldn't mind, is just then to respond to, so often the difficulty is coming up with novel ideas that are going to delight your client. And so we can go in and tinker around the edges, but how do you as a group come up with those scathingly brilliant ideas that are oftentimes really simple, but, and you know, that's what we all struggle with is sort of, you know, how do we actually do something that's going to be noticeably different in that experience? So two pieces. And thanks. This has been really interesting.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. And I mean, not giving me any softballs here. This is good. These are good questions. Okay. So the first one, when we think about people going through a service experience, we'll talk about the idea of behavior types. So what we'll do is try to identify through our research differences, not that are demographic, but differences in the ways people will behave when they interact with that experience. So for example, some people might not like technology. They might like steer away from technology. Or some people might be, they're just more research and negotiation oriented. So there might be ways in which you cluster people's behaviors that are helpful and meaningful to you when you're designing a service or experience for them. So we tend to think about it that way. Are there meaningful differences? And again, it could be, you could be like 8 years old or 80 years old and you behave the same way. We really want to understand behavioral differences. that's the way we deal with kind of segmentation around services and experiences. The novelty question, I mean, there's a couple of different things that are important there. One is you need to, I think if you're a person, a creative person, and you're working on these kinds of projects, you've got to kind of like get out of your industry ideas of what you're doing, and you have to look for other ideas. So often we're looking at analogs. You know, there's edge cases of innovators within industries, but often our inspiration comes from analogs. You know, there's the example of they wanted to improve ER response times for emergency room docs, and they actually looked at pit crews who would like change the tires in NASCAR, and they're like, how can they do that in 12 seconds? And it's taking us like 20 minutes to triage a patient, right? So I think often looking at, is there an analog in this category that actually, if I could extract some of it, and there's that kind of translational value that's important. That, and I'd say prototype and iterate. Make something and get it in front of people. Because, you know, we've had so many things we think are great ideas. Having multiple ideas, often when we're designing something, we'll almost think about it like equalizers on a stereo. We're like, what if we cranked this feature up and this one way down? Or what if we crank this one up and you know, make an image or a storyboard of it, and you show it to people, these different scenarios? That can be super helpful for just getting that. But I mean, you got to be willing to iterate too. It's like writing is rewriting, designing is redesigning, you know, like you just gotta kind of get it out there and just keep iterating. Shitty first draft, 100%.
So Alana, let's just put on the date to the Design Thinking Challenge so we can close off at 1 and then continue this conversation after we sort of get that done. So in closing to the formal part of the session, first of all, thank you so much, Chris. That was fantastic. And you could see as the questions are getting more and more hard-hitting. And I'm curious what will come next. Thank you to all of you who participated. So in terms of the Design Thinking Challenge, I've already explained what it is. I just want to explain what's going to happen is in January, we're going to announce what the challenge is. Every year it's different, but it's always of societal concern, and it's always something, there's always a client, someone who will take the ideas and hopefully put some of them into practice. And it will always be of relevance in multiple different, no matter where you're located, so that you can do the kind of research that Chris has talked about wherever you are, even though the client might be in Canada or in Victoria. So we will be announcing the challenge in January, and then you will have I think it's about 4 weeks to create a video entry, which you will submit and you will get feedback on. And that will really be focused on your observations and your insights more than your solutions. So the goal there is to go out and learn as much as you can about this challenge and gain insight about it, and things that maybe you would not have thought of before. And we have a whole rubric, and I'll be talking about that in January, but that will be but it will be heavily weighted on the insights you gain as opposed to the solution you come to. You'll submit that video. On March 5th, we start the live event, and that's where we're going to be meeting during the day, and you will be getting feedback from the judges who are more mentors than judges. They're people like Chris. We're going to be mentoring you so that when you come out of this challenge, you will know these skills even if you don't know them coming in. And so you will get feedback on whatever video you came to, and then you'll have 24 hours to revise based on the feedback. And this is where prototyping and iteration comes in. And this is where, where if you messed up on the first one, that's okay, because it's what you do with feedback and what you learn that really matters. Then we will be giving you a second challenge, and a totally different challenge after that will emerge from all the best ideas that come from that first 2 rounds where you do the video, you come back. We will then say to the client, okay, what do you now want them all to work on? And we'll go from there. So there's a 4-day virtual event. You can see the cost and all that on the side. Is not, no, you don't have to be a railroad student, but you do have to be an undergraduate business student to participate. We actually only have one slot left for the teams. It's almost full. But yes, Manuela is putting the link there. So that's sort of, so why don't we close off with that information, and let's continue with questions. If you have questions for me about Design Thinking Challenge, Amy Zidulka, I am absolutely available for all questions. If you are a design practitioner who is on the call right now and you might want to be a judge or a mentor, get in touch. We would love to hear from you. All right, so let's just, Alana, is there anything we should do before handing it back to Chris and going through more questions?
No, I think that's great. I'm going to bring the PowerPoint down and we'll go back into the Q&A. But I do want to mention, I know we're just at 1 o'clock right now, so if people do need to pop off, thank you so much for joining us. I will be sending out a recording later on today, so do know that. You can tune in and listen to what's left of our Q&A if you need to pop off now. So I will do this now.
So let's just continue. I'm going to read a question from the chat box, Chris. I would like to know, based on your experience, if traditional approaches to design thinking, teaching, and learning, sorry, I'm having trouble seeing the, and Lena, can you help me? I'm having trouble like learning, mainly those based on tools as 5 to 6 steps to reach a solution or problem are not also constraints for creativity. So this seems to be a question about when you go the traditional approach where you go through the 5 stages of design thinking, is that also a constraint or is that an enabler, or speak to that?
Yeah, I think that the breaking down design into a series of just steps to go through is what businesses love to do, because that's how they see the world, right? They love processes. And when you study management, it's about how do you break things down into pieces, often so that you can be predictable and so that you can scale things, right? Like that's part of what you hope to achieve when you're doing that like a traditional management approach. I don't think it works. I think this is the problem why most organizations actually fail when they're trying to bring this in, is this kind of approach often strips away a lot of the ways in which design as a practice actually works, like the kind of the real ways in which the methods need to work. And I think it's just one of these like clashes of different mindsets and approaches, this kind of scientific approach of saying, well, everything can be broken down into small pieces and you know, versus one that's more about craft, you know, and that actually you have to be good at this, you know, you have to spend time on it. Just like you know, if I gave you the example, you know, you could watch a YouTube video on how to build a house and you could understand all the steps, and I could give you a template on it. But would you want that person to build your house, or would you want somebody who's been doing it for 25 years to actually go in and do it, right? There's a craft element to this that's really critical. And in the ways in which design works and these kinds of research methods work, they have like a different history. They have a different kind of culture associated with them. They have different ways of working, which aren't always easy to fit in to a traditional organization. So yeah, I think it's a big problem. And I think that's why most organizations, the design teams either are frustrated or they end up failing after a couple of years.
Thanks. I'm going to jump in also with another viewpoint that I'd be curious about the same, because they asked in the question about not just using design, but teaching it as well. And in the Design Thinking Challenge, we will be using one of those processes, one of those steps. My experience is it's not enough, but having the step gives it legitimacy. Like saying to people, you have a stage now where you must empathize, actually gives people who might not think that being in business is about that, but might actually, that might be the very human part of them that they're craving to express. That I find that is one benefit of those stages, is that it gives that legitimacy and that permission. What are your thoughts on that, Chris?
I agree that having a structure, having a map helps you orient, but I think I would assume what works with that, and I mean my own experience with teaching it, is the difference is you're getting people to actually do it.
Right.
You know, you're not just giving them a series of steps to follow. You're actually having them engage. And like when I was talking about in the beginning, these different kind of muscles, you know, it's like, hey, I'm going to get you into the gym and you're used to like, you're a runner and you're used to running all the time, but I'm going to get you bench pressing and doing push-ups, you know, like you're actually getting them to engage different kinds of muscles. And I think that's part of what works with this kind of approach. It's like it's an applied thing. It's like, you know, if you want to learn to do these things, you have to practice them. It's like a craft, more of a craft-based approach.
Yeah. No. Yes. Another question in the chat box is, given that we're in a pandemic, what methods do you think are best and suitable for virtual teams?
Yeah, I think a lot of those methods, even the one when I was talking about the participatory one where having people visualize or talk about their experience, one thing we've been doing is with Google Slides, we'll actually provide a template and then have some like design icons or resources people can pull in, or they can just draw a picture, take an image and upload it into those slides. So you can actually have people using these remote facilitation tools. You can actually do that, which I think can be quite helpful. I think some of the other ones I talked about where, you know, using digital technology for people to actually, like the WhatsApp group and things like that, finding creative ways to participate with people. And the interesting thing with COVID, it's funny, before this I had a call and it was with a client about how they're basically having to transition their whole business to being digital, right? So the reality is people are like, the context of use now is online, right? So, I mean, that's a consideration as well, is with whatever, if what you're designing, if it's mainly going to be mitigated through technology, then you know, that's an appropriate method for you to actually collect that kind of information.
Okay. Josh, I see you. I'm going to go one more in the chat and then we'll come to you. Would you have an opinion on agile versus predictive processes? And as agile is more customer centric, but takes more time, question mark? Yeah,
I mean, I do feel like for us, if we work within an organization as a design firm and they're set up with an agile process, it works way better because they're able to actually take the things that we're prototyping and iterating and to implement them quite quickly, versus more of the waterfall that could be years, honestly, before a change starts to take place. We've had sessions, you know, co-design sessions back in the good old days when humans would be together in a room, but we've had co-design sessions with customers, and we had a VP of the digital team, and there was a big problem around getting people to use a digital channel for a part of their service that people didn't really trust. So we were prototyping it with customers, and they were there, and they literally after the session took these like shitty first drafts that we created, these kind of like sketches, and within weeks some of the ideas were implemented. You know, so I do think taking an agile approach really lends itself to that kind of iterative approach. Not for every problem, but certainly for a lot of them.
Josh, I might your question in the chat box. Do you want to ask your question from the chat box, or I'm going to just let you take the floor, and you can either do chat box or your new question.
I'll just take the liberty to ask 2 questions if that is permitted. One thing, question is that usually the space aspect of design thinking is not considered a principle in itself. Like usually if you go, people go for 5-step process, but if you go to other schools, some have 7, some have 9. Mm-hmm. So space in some school, like Hasso-Plattner, go for a space also as a principle. Mm-hmm. So do you have a view on space as a principle for design thinking, and what is your view on that space?
You don't mean like NASA space, you're talking about like a physical
space, just physical space, and what the impact that has on design thinking process in itself.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, often when we're going through a process, we'll think about prototyping in different mediums, right? So you might do a digital prototype, you might do physical things, and then often we'll enact things, right? So we'll go, okay, well, let's imagine we're actually having that interaction between the customer service rep and a customer, or we're doing the intake and we'll either sometimes starting in our studio, but often we'll go into the context of use and like actually go into the physical environment. We had a client that had deployed all of these they bought all these iPads to do things within their retail location, but they didn't know what they were going to do. It was one of these like, we'll figure, you know, like technology is the answer, but then they didn't know. And an interesting thing in the customer service interaction, because the iPad was facing the rep, the customer would become suspicious because they couldn't see the screen, you know, and that's like a subtle thing that only when we went in and we started enacting it in that space, in the physical space, we started to notice. So I do think actually getting into physical space, I think actually getting up and role playing and body storming or whatever, and actually using physical space, thinking about that. Even subtle things like if a desk is positioned right, you know, if I'm positioned right at a door, right when you come in, it's intimidating. Like if it feels like there's a gatekeeper, like these little subtle things that you notice when you actually prototype in space are quite important. So yeah, for sure.
And one more question, sorry for that, is the role of management in design thinking process. Like when you say you're trying to use a design thinking approach, it has become a kind of a buzzword, but it's like when you call about organizations, what role do you think is the management buy-in? How important is the senior management buy-in in that whole process? If that is not there, do you think the whole approach is applicable to some extent or not? Thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it work two ways, either grassroots, like top down is great because then like, especially things like constraints around budget and like staff to work on it and things like that, you can just, you know, it just makes life a lot easier. But I have seen it work with the more grassroots where, you know, people just go out and they show value. You know, they actually just start looking at problems, often problems that are ones that have been tried with more of a traditional approach, a technology solution, or a management consultancies come in and made a very expensive PowerPoint deck. And they're able to get in and actually make some progress on these things. I've seen that work as well, and that can lead to buy-in. But it certainly helps having senior management buy-in.
Any other questions? All right. All right, Chris, before we go, would you mind talking for just a couple of seconds about your new book that's coming out?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, it touches on the conversation we just had about trying to embed these design approaches within organizations. So it's called Double Bind, and it's about the clash between traditional approaches to management and design-based approaches to management. And it really looks at this issue that often people are on one hand celebrating design and saying we got to get, you know, innovative and we got to do design, but then when they try to practice it, there's all these kinds of like ways in which the organization works that are often unconscious, that are just kind of ways of doing things and norms, and that come into conflict with a design-based approach. So what we do is we look at 5 different specific conflict areas where there are these kinds of conflicts, and then talk about, you know, how do I see it coming? We're doing a lot of interviews with different leaders of, you know, who are kind of managing or directing design-based approaches, or internal teams who are trying to practice these things. And then we actually recommend some tools and practices that you can do to help get around it.
Thank you.
Thank
you so much, everybody. I will hand it over to Alana to close us off. Wonderful to connect again with you, Chris, and wonderful to connect with everyone on the call.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm going to just ask the one last question. Chris, when is the book going to be released?
Probably 2 years from now. It's through the University of Toronto Press, and I've been warned it's going to take a while.
Good to know. We'll all keep our eyes out for sure. Awesome. Well, I want to thank you so much, Chris, for joining us. It's been such a joy listening to you and your insights, and yeah, obviously so proud that you are part of our Royal Roads community. So thank you for spending the time and spending some extra time answering all the questions. I know a few of you maybe who are still on the call have some burning questions about the design thinking challenge. So do get in touch with us. We are here to support you through the process. So do know that. And I hope that everyone has a great day, and know that I will send out the recording, and you're welcome to share that with people as well. So I hope that everybody has a wonderful afternoon. Bye for now.
Thanks to everybody.